Hi everyone, this is Sarah Dasco with Project Engineer. We're back doing another teaching video, and this is about the 10 knowledge areas from PMBOK. So Project Engineer, we are here to help build better project managers every day, and we're trying to go through a bunch of topics that are pertinent to applying project management to everyday projects. This is the 10 knowledge areas. At Project Engineer, you can find a number of different resources as well. So projectengineer.net, you can see blogs that we have, other video tutorials. You can access Talent Hub, which is a great resource if you're looking for work. This is for contract work, part-time, full-time. If you have the experience and the know-how as a project manager, we'd love to have your profile up on our site. And we also have Nebulome, which is a great project management software you can use. You can use this for scheduling and communicating with your team. So again, some great resources online, check it out. And otherwise, let's jump into our topic today. So for this webinar, we are going to go through a quick introduction. We're going to talk about the 10 knowledge areas a little more in depth. We'll do a little introduction to each one, and we'll talk about the processes and outputs for each one. And then we'll do a quick summary review. So the 10 knowledge areas, as you can see here, we have a little quote from Bernie Rosecki, who wrote a blog on this about the 10 knowledge areas. This is taken directly from the website, so if you want to read more in depth, you can go on the website projectengineer.net. Otherwise, I will be referencing the blog throughout this teaching. So the 10 knowledge areas, they are the core technical subject matter of the project management profession, and they bring the project to life. When you think about the 10 knowledge areas, we want to think about how they breathe life into the project. Without considering these knowledge areas, you will be left scrambling, trying to resuscitate some lifeless project, and you will not understand why it's failing or why you're having so many challenges. But by being aware of these 10 knowledge areas and considering them as you go through the project, you'll see how considering them gives you more experience and more know-how for how to manage the different aspects of the project. These are the 10 knowledge areas: integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. Now, these are the 10 knowledge areas as of the PMBOK 6th edition. So there have been previous lists in the past that differ slightly in the naming of them. Some of these knowledge areas didn't exist in the past, like stakeholders, but this is the current list. Let's talk about integration. So integration, we want to think about how everything is connected, because with integration, this is how the project is held together. This is like the glue of all the other knowledge areas. So it's a little bit interesting that we start with integration, because sometimes it feels a little overwhelming to start with integration because it's taking into account all of the other knowledge areas and processes. But it is a good starting place because it gives us this, this perspective that everything needs to be taken into account. The quote from the blog here that I've got is, "This knowledge area contains the tasks that hold the overall project together and integrate it into a unified whole." Again, thinking about integration as the glue that keeps everything together. So in integration, we have a number of processes. We have 7 processes. We have the develop project charter, develop project management plan, direct and manage project work, manage project knowledge, monitor and control project work, and perform integrated change control, and finally close project or phase. Now, each of these processes has a corresponding output, and in fact often has more than one. But what I've done for this webinar today is I've just chosen probably the most important, or the most beneficial for you to remember output. And I've just put it next to the process right here. So you can see develop project charter has an output of project charter. Now, we just did an interview with Randy George, who's a PMP certified project manager and has been doing project management for a number of years. He's now an instructor. And he was saying that this process and this output are probably the most important process in this whole knowledge area. And the reason for this is the project charter is what initiates the project. This is what gives you authorization to start. We actually did a whole webinar interview about the project charter, and we also did a corresponding webinar. So if the project charter is something that you want to know more about or something that you struggle with, please be sure to check out that interview and that teaching video. We did that with Paul Robinson, and he had a lot of great insight into the benefits and the value, the components of what should be included in the project charter. The next one is develop project management plan, and this has output of the project management plan, so fairly intuitive. And this one, interestingly enough, this process, Randy George was saying, is probably the most overlooked. And I have to agree with him, because when we think about the real world, often project managers just get going. They feel the pressure to start the project and get it underway, and planning processes get missed. And maybe not in its entirety, it might not be skipped, but it won't be done as thoroughly as it should. So developing the project management plan is an incredibly important process. It's planning success into the project. That's not to say that your plans won't change. It's just to say you have a direction, you have a plan for how you're actually going to attack and approach the project. So this is an incredibly important process and output. Now, direct and manage project work, the output is the deliverables. So this is now with the project being underway in executing. Manage project knowledge. This is a new process, or a more recent process. And what you want to hear for the output is the lessons learned register. An interesting thing to think about here for lessons learned is not to just do lessons learned at the end of a project, which often happens. We get carried away, we forget, doesn't seem necessary. Maybe the project's going really well, so you don't do them. But you want to have lessons learned as a dynamic document that you've started and you've kept going throughout the project. Then we also have monitor and control project work, and an output there would be work performance reports. These will be used for senior management to make decisions. So we're evaluating what's been done and we're making decisions on the project work. Performing integrated change control. The output for this is approved change requests. Now, that's not to say that all change requests will be approved. It's just one of the common and significant outputs for this process. If you do have change requests that are not approved, you still go through the perform integrated change control process and you still document those changes. The final process is close project phase, and the output for that is the final report. So within this, you want to make sure you've tied that nice little bow on your project and everything is finished. And then the final report can be used for summarizing everything that happened and can then be used for future projects as well. Okay, so that's integration in a nutshell. Let's talk about scope. Scope is the next knowledge area, and we've got a nice little picture here. We've used before. You can see out through the scope. You can see everything that's included or not included, what's behind you in the project. Bernie Rosecki wrote, since scope changes are one of the top causes of project changes and grief in general, it is very important that the boundaries of the project be well defined from the outset and monitored rigorously. When I talked to Randy George about this concept of scope in this quote in particular, he very much agreed that scope needs to be monitored rigorously. And and can be a huge factor in a project's success or not. When you think about scope management, you're trying to balance scope with its competing constraints of cost and schedule. But scope is that foundation. If we don't know what's going to be included in the project, then we can't do a good job of satisfying stakeholder expectations. So let's talk a little bit about the processes in scope. We've got 6 processes here, and it's very heavy in planning. And then we have, again, those corresponding outputs. So for the first process, plan, scope, management, we have 6, I'll just read these first. Plan, scope, management, collect requirements, define scope, create WBS, validate scope, and control scope. And the first 4 are all in planning, and then the last 2 are in monitoring and controlling. So plan, scope, management, the outputs here are the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. Remember here that these management plans are methodological documents. They don't contain the scope or the requirements. They just set out how you will go about getting scope and how you will go about getting requirements. This is really important to remember because, as we said in this last knowledge area, the full project management plan will contain these subsidiary management plans. Collect requirements. This is probably one of the most challenging processes to do thoroughly. So there's 2 outputs that I've mentioned here, the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. We want to find out from stakeholders what their requirements are from the project or for the project. So at this point, all we're doing is we're taking in all of the requirements. What do they want? What do they want? What do they want? What are they expecting? And we're not filtering or screening them in any way. We're just taking it all in. So collecting all the requirements. We need to ask the question why. We need to get creative with our questions. We need to ask the same questions numerous times. We need to go back to the same people and have multiple conversations, because often it's even hard for stakeholders to vocalize what their requirements are because they just know in their mind what their expectations are. So this needs to be done very thoroughly in order to move on and have a good final grasp of scope, which doesn't happen for a little while. But let's talk about the next process, which is define scope. Here we do get our final project scope statement. This is where you're now deciding what's in and out of scope. So now at this point you can filter through those requirements. And really, really important to note here, you want to say what's in scope, but you also want to say what's out of scope. Okay, very important to consider. Create WBS is the next process, and the output, not as intuitive as you might think, you would think it's WBS, it's the scope baseline. The reason for this is the WBS is actually part of the scope baseline. That's the reason why the scope baseline is the output. You'd also be surprised at how many people don't do a WBS for a project, but I would probably put the WBS right up there with the project charter in terms of importance. Having not just the visual, but the documentation of something that contains 100% of the scope of the project is so important for avoiding scope creep and avoiding loss of scope, so missed scope. So the WBS is really important because it contains 100% of the scope of the project. And the last 2 processes here, validate scope and control scope, as I mentioned, are in monitoring and controlling. So validate scope has the accepted deliverables, and this is where we're monitoring the scope, we're accepting it, and by we accepting it, I mean the project sponsor. So at this stage, accepting the deliverable is the final check marker signing off from the project sponsor. The control scope, we've got here work performance information as an output. This is just as we're collecting the data, then we'll analyze that through work performance information. So again, both of these happening in monitoring and controlling. Let's talk about schedule. Schedule is the next knowledge area. And obviously, schedule is just the timing of the project. We want to keep the project on schedule. That is the goal and role of the project manager. And schedule often competes against scope and budget, so this can be very difficult to do. Bernie Rosecki writes, this is usually the most time-consuming of the knowledge areas. And again, in our interview with Randy George, he agreed that just planning the schedule and then keeping the schedule up to date can be something that consumes a lot of time for the project manager. When we look at the processes of schedule, we've got 6 processes here. And again, this is very planning heavy. So all of these activities, all of these processes are done in planning, and control schedule is done in monitoring and controlling. So plan schedule management, define activities, sequence activities, estimate activity durations, and develop schedule. All of this is planning. Control schedule is the only one in monitoring and controlling. So let's look at some of the important outputs here. Plan schedule management has an output of the schedule management plan. As we said, this is a methodological document. This is how are you going to go about developing your schedule? How are you going to go about the schedule management for the project? In define activities, what we have as outputs are an activity list, activity attributes, and a milestone list. Milestones being often set by senior management. They already may have expectations of what those milestones are. Milestones have 0 duration, and they are just moments to celebrate. As one of our interviewees, Paul Robinson, said, these are things that we can look forward to in the project, targets that we've reached. The activity list is essentially, as the name suggests, just a list of all the activities that need to be done on the project. And the activity attributes is a corresponding document that expands upon those activities. So if we have the activities, then we also have all these features and attributes, details about what those activities actually look like. Maybe what the work package they're part of, who's responsible for them, if there's a cost attached to them, if there's perceiving activities to them, that kind of thing. All that information could be found here. Then we have sequence activities, and under sequence activities, the output would be the network diagram. So at this point, after you've figured out all the activities that need to be done, now you actually put them in a logical sequence. What's important here is that our only goal is to find out how they logically depend upon each other. If, for example, one activity needs to go before another activity, if those activities can be done simultaneously, that kind of thing is what is accomplished here. Estimate activity durations. Now, at this point, once you have the sequence of the activities, you will estimate how long those activities will take. And you'll have this sister document, as I like to call it, a basis for those estimates as well. So here's where you say how long, how much time those activities will take. Once you've done these in this particular order, okay, so planning processes need to go in order, then you can do develop schedule. So for the develop schedule process, the outputs are the schedule baseline, the schedule itself, and project calendars. When resources are able to work, when they're not able to work, or what calendar you'll be following for the project. All these kinds of things will be included here. And then the last process, control schedule, you have your schedule forecasts. So in monitoring and controlling, you're now looking ahead to the future to see Where are we going to be? Are we on schedule? Will we be on schedule? What is our projected trajectory? Okay, let's now talk about cost. Cost is the third side of that triple constraint: scope, schedule, cost. So these three are always competing with each other. And frequently cost is number one in the minds of the sponsor or the stakeholders. Not always, but very frequently. And is something that the project manager needs to manage very tightly or very closely to ensure there's no overruns. Now, according to PMBOK, the project manager's job is to actually have zero variance for cost, not to be under or over budget. And in the real world, often people think under budget is better, but for project management, we just want to be on budget. And I think for the reasons given, Bernie has this quote here from the blog: the project budget is usually one of the most sensitive parts of the project. And what I mean for the reasons given is this is usually the biggest priority, the most significant success criteria for a lot of stakeholders and sponsors on a project. Again, not always, but often. And as Randy George said in our interview, he found that cost usually came first, and then scope, and then schedule. So cost was always top of mind. Now, he had examples of where he revisited projects, and upon reviewing the requirements and the scope desired by the stakeholders, they were able to increase budget. But and that can happen, and that's a good way to go about project management, because you don't want to start the project with unrealistic expectations. But just the example, you keep in mind that cost is one of the largest priorities of the stakeholders. So unless you have a really good reason for adjusting that budget, your job is to stay on budget. Okay, let's talk about the 4 processes here in cost. And again, planning heavy. So we have 3 processes in planning: plan, cost management, estimate costs, and determine budget. And then we have control costs, which is happening in monitoring and controlling. So for plan cost management, the output is the cost management plan. Again, how are we going to manage costs? How are we going to determine costs? All of this should be in your plan. The estimate cost process has 2 main outputs of cost estimates and the sister document of the basis of estimates. So this is where you put forward what you believe the project will cost. And once that has been approved or signed off on, then you can go to determine budget. So again, planning processes go in order, whereas the other processes don't necessarily go in order. And determine budget has the output of cost baseline. So this is what you're actually going to you're going to compare your actuals to. So you have your actuals and your planned, and then you have your funding requirements. So at what point in the project do we need what kind of funding? And finally, in control costs, which is happening in monitoring and controlling, we have our cost forecasts. Where are we in terms of cost? Where are we going? What are our projected costs for the project? Now I mentioned here that the planning processes go in order, and I just wanted to also point out that a lot of this is iterative. So after we get to a certain point, we do often go back and update these things. So it's not as if they're permanent or written in stone. It's just that they have an order to them, so that, and then a sequence, so that you can get an accurate cost baseline. If you don't do estimate costs, if you don't do it in this order, then you don't have as accurate of a cost baseline. But again, that's not to say that you wouldn't or you couldn't go back and adjust this, for example, after you do your risk assessment. Okay, let's talk about quality. I know we're going through these pretty quickly. This is an overview, but we have a lot more on the website as well. So if this is going quickly, just remember there's a lot more resources there. For quality, we're taking a close look, hence the magnifying glass. We're taking a close look at what we're doing, and not just in terms of what we're producing in terms of the product, but also our process for how we're producing the product. A quote from the blog here: "The quality level should be established during project planning and specified within the project management plan. Then, when issues arise regarding product specifications, there's a plan to deal with it." This was adamantly agreed to by Randy George in our interview. He said, if you don't plan this, you're going to be reacting to it, and that's going to cost a lot more money. And I loved one of the stories he shared about one of his colleagues, one of his managers, who kept going to a team member saying, okay, we need this level of quality, we need this. And the team member kept saying, well, we don't have time, we don't have time. And one day the manager finally sat everyone down and said, listen, if we don't have time to do it right the first time, how are we going to find time to fix it the second, third, fourth time? And I thought that was such an apropos anecdote, because we often think, oh, we just need to get going, we just need to do the project. But really, if we feel that way because we feel like the time constraint is there, we're going to end up spending more time fixing the problem later. So really, project management is about planning quality into the project. Now, this knowledge area has one process in planning, plan quality management, one process in executing, manage quality, and one process in monitoring and controlling, control quality. So the outputs for plan quality management is the quality management plan and the quality metrics. Again, these are my opinion on what are the most important outputs, okay? And I would say here that for the quality management plan, like we just discussed, this is how you're going to plan quality into the project. How are you going to manage quality? How are you going to determine quality? And the quality metrics is that document, that extra document that has all of those metrics you want to be watching, monitoring for throughout the project. Okay, manage quality. Manage quality has the outputs of the quality reports and the test and evaluation documents. So at this point, the project is underway, you're in executing. Now you're going to be looking at what's being produced and how. So remember, not just the product, service, or result that's being produced, but also the processes for how those are being produced. And then control quality, you're looking at the quality control measurements and verified deliverables. Now, what I want to say here about the verified deliverables is that at this stage, this is where the project manager is the one checking off and signing those deliverables. Remember back in scope, we talked about accepted deliverables. That's where the sponsor is actually signing off on them. Okay, so very important distinction there, because obviously the project manager is checking the deliverables throughout the project, but the final say, the final acceptance under the scope knowledge area lies with the project sponsor. No, not with all project stakeholders, because that's just far too many. And to get a unanimous decision that all the stakeholders are satisfied and have accepted the deliverables would be impossible. So at this point, it's the project manager, and the final say is the project sponsor. Okay, let's now talk about resources. Resources here being people, materials, equipment, labor, materials, and equipment, any of that. So when you think about a project, this is any of the equipment being used or the materials needed for the project, and any team members on the project. And this knowledge area does focus a little bit more on the project team. So the quote here from Bernie Rozecki is, The project team is usually one of the most important factors in the success of a project. If you have a good team, you will have a successful project. Now, this was an interesting conversation piece for Randy, George, and myself, because he did partially agree with this, but he also mentioned that you can have all the right people, but going in all the wrong direction. So we kind of had a conversation, and I mentioned that maybe the idea here is if you have the right people, you have a better chance of success. If you have the wrong people, you're just more likely to fail. So really, we need the right people for the job. Let's look at the processes and outputs here. We have plan resource management, estimate activity resources, and these are in the planning process group. Then we have acquire team, develop team, and manage team, which is in executing. And then we have control resources, which is in monitoring and controlling. So for plan resource management, if you haven't noticed the pattern already, we have the resource management plan. How are we going to manage the resources on the project? What is our plan for all of this? Not necessarily who and what the resources are, but how are we going to manage it? For estimate activity resources, I have 3 outputs here: the resource requirements, the basis for those estimates, and the resource breakdown structure. I should just point out here that RBS can be risk breakdown structure as well, so be aware of using this acronym. Acquire team, now this is acquiring your full team, and this will happen in executing. So yes, you do have your team in planning, but this is your full team. The outputs here would be your physical resource assignments, so who's doing what, your team assignments, and your resource calendars. When are resources available? Are there holidays or transitions or that kind of thing happening? And then develop team. This is the output here is your team performance assessments. How well is the team doing? And manage team, you just have document updates as an output. And control resources, we have work performance information as an output. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here though about this develop manage team and resources knowledge area in general is that this is really where leading your team comes into play. So all of those soft skills, the ideas of motivating, inspiring your team, all of this happens under the resource knowledge area. So we find a lot of theories in this in this knowledge area. We find Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid. We have the hygiene motivator factors. We have theory X and theory Y. We have theory Z. We have all kinds of different theories for how to manage people, how to build teams, get them working together. There's theories on team development, how teams join together and how they develop through the various stages. So this is kind of getting into a little more of that soft skills area. We really need to remember that this is the project manager's job. Having the right team, but as Randy George was saying, getting them to go in the right direction. That is huge. That is what the project manager is supposed to be doing. Okay, let's talk about communication. This ties in nicely with resources because communication is 90% or more of what the project manager does. Again, that continuation of the soft skills, so getting your team together, facilitating meetings, facilitating that one-on-one relationship with your core team, all of that is incredibly important and relevant to what the project manager's role is. From the blog, Bernie writes, communication with stakeholders is often the key factor that allows stakeholders to be satisfied, even when unexpected changes happen. And I would totally agree with this quote, because if you have a good relationship and you have good communication going with your stakeholders, even when they're not expecting a change, if you're communicating with them, then they can still be satisfied knowing that their requirements are being met, because you're communicating with them that you're managing the project successfully and according to what's going to be best for the stakeholders in the end. If we drop that communication and we have less frequent communication, or we're missing key elements in communication, that's when stakeholders can get frustrated, or they start assuming that everything is going well, and then months later they're upset because they thought something was happening when it wasn't. Under oh, and one other thing I was going to say, about communication is from the interview with Randy George, he was talking about how he has the communications management plan is one of the most important documents, because if you don't have this plan, even if you have a team of 2 or 3, it doesn't matter. You need to have some detailed plan for how you're going to communicate, how frequently you're going to communicate, and what you're going to communicate. And when I asked him, what are the normal pieces of information that you would include in a communication management plan, or how you communicate, he had some interesting things to say. So first of all, let's just walk through this. I'll get to Randy's point in a second here. We have 3 processes in communication: plan communications management, which is the communications management plan. So how are you going to communicate? What does that look like? And then that happens in planning. You have managed communications, which happens in executing. And the output here is just the nebulous term project communications. So all of the communication that happens on a project, all the conversations, all the phone meetings, the Zoom meetings, the emails, the formal documentation, all of that communication falls under managed communications. And then monitor communications, which is the 3rd process here, and the last one, happens in monitoring and controlling, and the output is work performance information. So that analyzed data from direct and managed project work. Now, what I wanted to say here about the pieces of information that are important to communicate, not just Randy George, but project managers, directors, team leaders that I've spoken with, they want to be communicated regarding the triple constraint. Okay, scope, cost, schedule. That's obvious, that's hugely important. And then Randy added a 3rd one, which was risk updates. So he said that he creates this dashboard, this 1-page kind of outline. It's a monthly update that he sends out. It has the milestones, it says where they're at, the key targets for next month. It has a breakdown of the budget, so a synopsis of the budget, including cost forecasts. And then it has an outline of some risks, as well as the plan or the responses planned for those risks. And this could be something maybe sent out monthly if you're working on a tighter schedule, or you have stakeholders that want more frequent communication. You can do weekly updates and a version of that. But those are the main components that stakeholders want information on. All right, let's talk about risk. Risk as a knowledge area, according to PMBOK. Actually, before I tell you the definition, I'll ask you, what do you think risk is? What is risk? Most people in their mind think negative. Most people think loss, they think trouble, and they think problem. But according to PMBOK, risk is just uncertainty. It's just throwing the dice and either something positive or something negative will happen. So risk is uncertainty, according to PMBOK, and we need to keep that in mind because positive risks can happen on a project, and the project manager can then take advantage of those positive risks. The quote from the blog here is that managing project risk is one of the most underrated aspects of project management. And when you think about this, managing project risk can be time consuming. Project managers can feel like they're not the subject matter expert, and so they don't find the time or they don't have the people to do it. But really, it's the job of the project manager to ensure it happens. And that means getting subject matter experts, SMEs, together and getting that list of risks and going through and analyzing them together. Now, I've heard of projects where they outsource this entirely to another company, which is fine. That's one way of doing it. But the project manager still needs to be fully aware of, and managing that. Randy George gave the example of himself running a project where he wasn't the subject matter expert on a particular part of the project, and so he brought in all the business analysis, and then together they came up with a list of all, well, maybe not all, but they came up with a list of risks and then had their risk register produced. So this is just an example of him taking the initiative, ensuring that he's doing his due diligence and managing the project appropriately. Now, here we have a lot of processes. We have, and also this is a planning heavy knowledge area. So plan risk management, identify risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, plan risk responses. All of this is happening within planning. All of these are happening within planning. Not until implement risk responses are we in executing, and then monitor risks is in monitoring and controlling. Remember here as we go through these first 5 that planning processes go in order. So the first thing we do is plan risk management, and the output here is a risk management plan, answering the question, how are we going to go about managing risk on the project? This doesn't contain risks in it. Okay, it's not until the next process, which is identify risks, that we have the outputs of risk register and risk report. The risk register being what I just alluded to when I told that example of Randy George working with the business analysts, coming up with the risks that could occur on the project. And then the risk report is something that you will update, as you can see here, document updates. That's very much relating to updating the risk report here. And this is what you will send out to stakeholders as needed and as determined by your plans. So after you've identified risks, then what you do is you perform qualitative risk analysis. Now, performing qualitative risk analysis has a little bit of subjectivity built into it. Okay, so what you want to keep in mind here for perform qualitative risk analysis is that there is some subjectivity built into this, but you're using this analysis for all of the risks you've identified on the risk register, and then you will carry forward only your medium or high risks to the quantitative risk analysis level. Okay, so again, these are going in order, but once you get to the quantitative risk analysis, that's where there's more in-depth analysis and evaluation of risks, and again, only on maybe the medium to high risks. Depending on your stakeholders' tolerance and threshold for risks, you'll take whatever risks they want forward. Now, that's not to say you abandon all of the other risks from the risk register. You keep all of them, all the low and other medium risks, you keep them on your watch list, okay? Because they may become medium, or high risks. They may change or evolve as the project progresses. Once you've done all of this, then you do the plan risk responses. So for plan risk responses, we just have the output of change requests. But at this stage, you're going to have your plan for how you will respond, very intuitive, to the risks if they occur. So you, as a project manager, are not the only one who's going to be responsible for that. You're not the one who's going to respond to every risk. So here you would have listed who's going to respond and how they're going to respond. Those things will be included here. Implement risk responses, again, as the name is fairly intuitive, this is what happens during executing. So once risks have occurred, now you're implementing whatever plan you had, whatever responses you had in place. And that includes your plan A, your contingency plans, but also your plan B, your fallback plans. This is also where your workarounds will happen, those impromptu decisions and actions that you could not have planned or didn't plan. And finally, monitor risks. You have your work performance information and change requests as outputs. Fairly normal for monitoring and controlling processes. All right, let's talk about procurement. Procurement is an interesting knowledge area. This is buying, selling, leasing, renting, anything that is external to the organization, and anything that, if goes wrong, they could sue you. If somebody can sue you, it's procurement. So in this knowledge area, we have contracts being signed. In this knowledge area, because it's such a precise skill or knowledge, often you have a centralized procurement department in an organization who is handling your contracts and the contract negotiations. All the contract terminology, etc., would be handled or could be handled by a centralized procurement department. Now, on smaller projects or smaller organizations, it's decentralized, and the project manager does handle this, does manage this, which can be quite stressful. It should be noted, though, that even if you're in a centralized procurement department, the project manager is heavily involved. They're fully aware of the contract and what it means, because the project manager has to be the one managing this, but they don't lead the negotiations. The procurement manager will lead that. Again, here, let's look at what Bernie says from the blog. Hiring subcontractors can get the job done quicker or with better expertise, but sacrifices the ability to control the quality, schedule, or other factors. Also, the fine print often results in budget and schedule overruns that were not envisioned. So here you can see what Bernie's getting at, what I was talking about on the previous slide, with procurement being such a specialized knowledge area. If the contract and the procurement statement of work are not done thoroughly enough or to detail, this will result in budget and schedule overruns. So it's really important for the procurement statement of work and the contract to be done meticulously and with everything clearly and explicitly stated. Because if the contractor comes to you and says, we've done everything according to the procurement statement of work, we're done the project, but you're not happy, you, the project manager, have done something wrong. Probably one of the pitfalls of procurement is that you do sacrifice the ability to control quality, schedule, and some other factors. But then the benefit is obviously that you're hiring experts. This is what they do. So they're usually more efficient, and it will make for a very successful project. But this is just a little more hands-off. So procurement is a tricky knowledge area to manage. In terms of processes, there's only 3 processes: plan procurement management in planning, conduct procurements in executing, and control procurements in monitoring and controlling. Now, before you think I couldn't make up my mind, there are just a number of outputs for plan procurement management that are important to include here. There's even more outputs than this, but plan procurement management has just a number of outputs that are important to just at least walk through briefly. The first one being the procurement management plan, which, as we know now, is that methodological document telling us how we're going to manage procurement in the project. We'll also have a procurement strategy. This would be decided up front before you get into executing. You have any bid documents, RFPs, RFQs, RFIs. You have your procurement statement of work that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago. You have your source selection criteria. How are you going to decide who gets the job? You have make or buy decisions. Are you going to make things in-house, or are you going to procure them? Doing things in-house means a reason you might choose to do things in-house would be if there's some confidentiality or privacy issues. You want to keep that internal, but choosing to go external, like we mentioned, there might be greater expertise in doing that. And then the last output here that I've got listed as important is independent estimates, because as companies and organizations submit their proposals, you may want an independent estimate so you can compare those. Now, in conduct procurements, this is maybe less intuitive than some of the other outputs and processes, but it's not until conduct procurements in executing that you actually select the sellers and sign the agreements. So all of the work, the pre-work here is in planning, but finally selecting the sellers and having the agreement signed is actually part of executing conduct procurements. And then the last process here to mention is control procurements. And the output here is your closed procurements. So interestingly enough, this is where you would, in monitoring and controlling, you would deal with any claims and disputes, and you'd go through that dispute resolution process. So you'd go through negotiations or mediation, arbitration, or litigation as needed. Hopefully litigation wouldn't be required. At least it should not be your first resort. It should be your last resort. If at all possible, try to negotiate and settle those claims or issues. Okay, let's talk about our last knowledge area, which is stakeholders. And we actually did a webinar interview and a webinar teaching series on the stakeholders because it is such a crucial part of any project. And we met with Karen Hasselback, and she had a lot of great stories to tell and a lot of great insight for how to deal with stakeholders, how to manage, how to engage them, if there's difficult stakeholders, what you can do. And she was a great person to interview and had a lot of great insight. So definitely check that webinar out. Our stakeholders are really anyone affected by the project or who can affect the project, and also anyone who perceives themselves to be affected by the project. So the list can be quite long. And according to Bernie, there's nothing more important than the project stakeholders. You could, in theory, declare a project a success if the stakeholders are satisfied, but the project was a disaster. Now, this was also an interesting conversation piece for Randy, George, and myself, because he agreed that in theory you could declare it as a success, but in actuality it would be unlikely that if you had a disaster that the stakeholders would be satisfied. And I chuckled because I have to agree that if everything's a disaster, it would be hard. You'd be hard pressed to find stakeholders who are satisfied. But Bernie Rozecki is correct. If they're satisfied and they've accepted the deliverables, they've accepted the project, that's all that matters. And if the project was a disaster in terms of how things came together or how the team worked or whatever, if there was issues or changes or any of the above. If there was a disaster, it's moot if the stakeholders are satisfied, because that is the ultimate job of the project manager. So in this knowledge area, we have 4 processes. Identify stakeholders, which harkens back now to initiating. So this is one of the 2 processes in initiating. And then plan stakeholder engagement in planning, manage stakeholder engagement in executing, and monitor stakeholder engagement in monitoring and controlling. So the most important outputs here are the first 2. So in identify stakeholders, you have the output of stakeholder register. You want a list of all the stakeholders who are involved, again, affected, or can affect, or perceived to be affected by the project. And you also want a stakeholder engagement plan. So this is the output here in the planning process group. This is so important for how you're going to engage your stakeholders. How are you going to ensure their interaction? How are you going to communicate with them? What are you going to do if you have difficult stakeholders, or you have difficult stakeholders assigned to the project? This is where all of that, again, soft skills comes into play for the project manager. I had the interview with Randy George. Again, he had some interesting things to say about stakeholders. And he commented that for difficult stakeholders, obviously you want to have frequent interaction. You want to send them the information that they've requested, like we talked about, the triple constraint plus risk. You want to also show them the benefit of what you're doing, and hopefully that will get them involved. And his preferred method of communication was the in-person or the real-time communication, so on the phone or meetings on Zoom and other platforms like that, video conferencing calls. If you have a problem with somebody, you just call them up, find out what the issue is, and then you're able to move on a little bit quicker, follow it up with an email, and then it's dealt with. But I also really liked what he said about the important thing here with stakeholders is making sure they feel heard and giving them a sense of belonging. And what I really liked about that is, again, as I mentioned in the interview with him, it's human nature to want to belong. But having that belonging and that ownership and that attachment to the project is so important, because otherwise stakeholders won't be involved and they won't care. So yeah, again, we're just getting into that kind of soft skills, that people relationship type work that the project manager has to do. And he actually gave an example connecting procurement to stakeholders on how these soft skills, these people skills, was really what helped ensure the success of the project, because he was working with a subcontractor, or contractor, who was a single source vendor, which meant that he wasn't able to go anywhere else or choose another contractor. So his leverage was really limited in terms of getting this contractor to change how he was doing things, because there was an issue and they needed to fix a few things. And what ended up being the resolution of the problem was having upper management who had a good relationship with the contractor's upper management just talk it out. So because they had a relationship and they were able to rely on that, then they could pass down the message to their respective parties. And yeah, that's just an example of how communication, stakeholders, procurement all works together. And really all of these knowledge areas are integrated. Let's just end quickly with the managed stakeholder engagement. Output here is change requests, and monitor stakeholder engagement is the WPI and change requests. So again, as you're going through the project and you're interacting with your stakeholders, obviously that will result in change requests. And so then you put that forward through your perform integrated change control. Okay, so that was the really quick version of the 10 knowledge areas. We did an introduction to them, and how important the knowledge areas are, how they bring life to the project. We talked about all 10 knowledge areas. We did an introduction to them, we defined them, we gave some examples, we discussed the processes of each knowledge area, and we talked about the most important outputs that relates to those processes. So that's our review of all of this, all 10 knowledge areas. If you have questions, you have thoughts on it, please message us, contact us, find other resources on the website as well. You can go to projectengineer.net, you can look at the blogs, you can look at our other video tutorials, you can sign up for Talent Hub, you can also sign up for Nebulum for free for the project management software. There's a lot on our website, so please go there. And we're so happy to have you here joining us. Thank you very much. I'm Sarah Daska with Project Engineer, where we're just trying to help develop project managers better, make project managers better for everyday projects. So if you have any questions or anything else that you want to learn, please message us. We'd be happy to help train you and teach you on that. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye now.